Welcome back to our channel Quick Learning. Hope you guys are fine. So this is a topic of difference between developed countries and developing countries, and you will find all the basic differences in your businesses and in your MBA related activities or in your basic life term activities in my channel. So kindly subscribe to my channel. Thank you. So in this video, you will find a comparison chart, the definition, key differences, and finally, I will conclude this presentation for you guys. So on the left hand side, you find a very brief picture of difference between them. So you can see in developing countries, all the waste are on the roads and the dogs and other animals are there. But in the developed countries, the garbage or the waste is in trucks. So, basically, countries are divided into two major categories by the United Nations, which are developed countries and developing countries. So, the classification of countries is based on the economic status such as GDP, GNP, per capita income, industrialization, the standard of living, etc. So, the developed countries refers to the sovereign state whose economy has highly progressed and possesses great technological infrastructure as compared to other nations. So the countries with low industrialization and low human development index are termed as developing countries. So in developing countries you means you have a low industrialization and low human index. Okay. Then after a thorough research on the two, I have compiled the difference between developed countries and developing countries considering various parameters in tabular form. So you will find a comparison chart. First of all, meaning. So, the meaning of developed countries is a country having an effective rate of industrialization and individual income is known as developed country. But the developing country means is a country which has a low rate of industrialization and low per capita income. So, the unemployment and poverty in developed countries is low, but in developing countries is high. Then the rates of developed countries like infant mortality rate, death rate and the birth rate is low, while the life expectancy rate is high. But it is opposite to developing countries because in developing countries, high infant mortality rate, death rate and birth rate along with low life expectancy rate. So the living conditions of developed countries is good, or you can say very good. In some countries it is very good, but the living conditions of developing countries are moderate or poor. So developed countries generate more revenue from industrial sector and developing countries generate more revenue from service sector. So the growth in developed countries is high industrial growth, but the developing countries they rely on the developed countries for their growth. So the standard of living in developed countries is high, but in developing countries is low. Then the distribution of income in developed countries is equal, but in developing countries is unequal. So the factors of production in developed countries is effectively utilized, but in developing countries they are ineffectively utilized. So this is a basic comparison chart between both of them. So now the definition of developed countries. So basically, developed countries are the countries which are developed in terms of economy and industrialization. The developed countries, also known as advanced countries for the first world countries, as they are self-sufficient nations. So the Human Development Index, also known as HDI, statistics rank the countries based on their development. So the country which is having a high standard of living, high GDP, high child welfare, healthcare, excellent medical transportation, communication and educational facilities, better housing and living conditions, industrial infrastructure and technological advancement, higher per capita income, increase in life expectancy, etc. They are known as developed countries. But these countries generate more revenue from the industrial sector as compared to service sector as they are having a post-industrial economy. So the following are the names of some developed countries. So you can say Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland and United Nations. These are developed countries. So now moving towards The definition of developing countries. So, the countries which are going through the initial levels of industrial development along with low per capita income are known as developing countries. These countries come under the category of third world countries, and they are also known as lower developed countries. So, developing countries depend upon the developed countries to support them establishing industries across the country. So, the country has a low human development index. So, the country have low gross domestic product, high illiteracy rate, less educational, transportation and communication. Medical facilities are not very good, unsustainable government debt, unequal distribution of income, high death rate and birth rate, malnutrition both to mother and infant, which cause high infant mortality rate, and the high level of unemployment and poverty. So these are the example of developing countries like Colombia, India, Kenya, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Thailand and Turkey. So now I will tell you about the key differences between both of them. So first of all, human poverty index. So in developing countries, the probability of at birth dying before at the age of 40, but in developed countries the age is 60. And the percentage of people unable to read or write in developing countries, but the percentage of people unable to read and write is less. Then the population below income poverty line is very high, but the population with less than 50% of average income in developed countries. Then this difference is the national wealth of developed countries is high, but in developing countries it is moderate. And the finance of developed countries is developed and integrated, but in developing it is less developed. Then the standard of living of developed countries is good, but in developing it is moderate. Then character of economy in developed countries is service, but in developing countries is industrial. Then the factors of production in developed countries is effectively used, but in developing not effectively used. Then perspective of growth in developed countries is technological progress, but in developing it's capital accumulation. Then internal violence of developed countries is low, but in developing countries is moderate. So another difference between them, so the issues in developed countries, specific sources of GHG is very high fossil fuel consumption, transport, thermoelectricity, and industrial household heating. But the issues in developing countries is low fossil fuel consumption, deforestation, land use, and firewood. So specific processes of developed countries are CO2 from combustion, CH4 emissions from natural gas, soil and coal mining, and in developing countries it is CO2 from combustion and CH4 from land use. So time of developed countries is like past and present contribution, but in developing is future contribution. Then specific solutions of developed countries is low energy intensity, higher efficiency, energy conservation, potential alternative technologies. But in developing countries, is uses of renewable energy, hydro and biomass, potential solar and wind energy. So the dominant variable of developed countries is high energy consumption per capita, but in developing countries is population growth with low energy per capita. So finally, I will conclude my presentation. This presentation is a bit longer than my rest of the presentations because it has a lot of data. I put my a lot of effort to summarize it. So there is a big difference between developed countries and developing countries. As the developed countries are self-contained, flourished, while the developing countries are emerging as a developed country. So the developing countries are the one which experience the phase of development for the first time. So if we talk about developed countries, they are post-industrial economies, and due to this reason, the maximum part of their revenue comes from the service sector. So developed countries have a high human development index as compared to the developing countries, and the former has established itself in all fronts and made itself sovereign by its efforts, while the latter is still struggling to achieve the same. So that's all from my side. Thank you so much. Kindly subscribe to my channel, like and share. And if you have any query, then comment me.